Imagine for a second that you are handed this, this highly complex, meticulously researched architectural blueprint.
Okay.
It's like a master plan. It details exactly how to build this totally self-sustaining city, complete with a flawless power grid, equitable housing, and an agricultural system that basically ensures nobody ever goes hungry.
Right, a real marvel of engineering.
Exactly. But instead of buying concrete or, hiring engineers to actually build the thing, you take this blueprint, you frame it in gold, you hang it on your living room wall, and you simply read the words aloud to yourself every single night before you go to sleep.
Wow, yeah.
You just chant the measurements of the plumbing system, kind of hoping that the sheer act of reciting the blueprint will magically conjure a house for you to live in. And then when it rains and you get soaked, you sit there wondering why the blueprint isn't protecting you.
I mean, it's a devastating image, really. It's the ultimate confusion between the map and the destination. You're basically confusing the instruction manual with the actual machine itself.
That is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to another deep dive. We are talking directly to you, the learner. We know you're here because you're insanely curious, and you really want to look past the surface-level noise to understand the mechanics of the world.
Yeah, and today we're examining a concept that perfectly mirrors that blueprint analogy you just made.
We are looking at what happens when millions, maybe even billions of people take a text that literally demands socioeconomic justice, systemic equality, and practical institution building, and they reduce it to, well, a mere religious placeholder.
Right. Something that's just whispered for spiritual blessings rather than actually implemented as a civilizational engine. It's a profound shift in perspective.
It really is. To explore this today, we're diving into the rational school of thought of Allama G. Parwez. Specifically, we're looking at his extensive lectures and writings on the Quran, kind of zeroing in on his analysis of Surah Al-Imran, verse 144.
Yeah, Parwez was this 20th century thinker who essentially argued that humanity has fallen into this, what he calls a ritual trap. We've basically taken a robust constitution and turned it into a book of magic spells.
Now, before we get into the weeds of this, we really need to set the stage properly, because this is incredibly dense, highly historically charged material.
It absolutely is. And because our source material today touches very heavily on, Islamic theology, historical sectarianism, and the evolution of political governance, I want to state explicitly to you, our listener, right out of the gate, we are not taking any sides here.
Right.
We are not endorsing the religious, historical, or political viewpoints of the original author, nor are we validating or invalidating the traditional orthodox views that he critiques so heavily. Our mission today is simply to act as your impartial guides.
We're just the messengers here.
Exactly. We're unpacking the fascinating intellectual arguments, the historical claims, and those socio-economic theories contained entirely within the provided text. We just want to understand the architecture of this specific rationalist framework.
We're basically explorers walking through a newly discovered city, trying to figure out how the architect intended the plumbing to work. We aren't here to decide if it's the best city in the world, just to understand its design.
I like that.
And our mission today is ambitious. We're going to decode specific Arabic terms to uncover this systemic socio-economic model. We'll explore the system of providence, unpack a really fascinating scientific concept the author calls the law of requital, and reveal how humanity's intellectual maturity fundamentally changes our responsibility to the world.
It's a packed agenda.
It is.
Huh?
Okay, let's unpack this. Where does this start? Because from what I read in the sources, Parwez anchors this entire massive socio-political theory in one very specific, very bloody day in history.
He does, yeah. To understand the theory, you really have to understand the trauma that birthed the verse he analyzes. Because context is everything here. The source material roots its entire analysis in the Battle of Uhud.
Paint that picture for us. What's the reality on the ground during this battle?
Well, we're in the early 7th century, right in the nascent years of the Islamic community in Medina. The Muslims are engaged in this fierce, total existential battle against the vastly superior military forces of Mecca right at the base of Mount Uhud.
Okay, setting the scene.
Now, initially, the Muslims actually have the upper hand. They have a solid tactical advantage. But due to a massive breach in discipline, basically a group of archers abandons their strategic position on a hill to collect spoils of war, the Meccan cavalry flanks them.
Oh, wow. So just an absolute tactical disaster.
Total chaos. I mean, the battle lines just dissolve. It becomes this brutal hand-to-hand combat in the dust and the heat. And during this absolute chaos, a rumor suddenly spreads across the battlefield.
What's the rumor?
It moves like wildfire through the ranks. The rumor is that the Prophet Muhammad has been killed.
Man, I cannot even begin to imagine the psychological devastation of that moment for those people.
The source text describes it as a paralyzing shock. You really have to put yourself in the shoes of his companions. For many of them, their entire world, their brand new social order, their newfound faith, it was entirely tethered to the physical existence of this single man.
Right, because he wasn't just a priest, he was the head of state.
Exactly. He was their general, their chief justice, their spiritual guide, their executive branch. So if he's lying dead in the dirt, what is left? Why even keep fighting? The text notes that panic and absolute despair just gripped them. Some dropped their weapons. Some even considered surrendering to the Meccans right then and there.
It is the ultimate crisis of leadership. The linchpin has been completely removed and the wheel is just flying off the axle.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's in the immediate aftermath of this specific visceral psychological crisis that verse 144 of Surah Al-Imran is revealed to the community.
Which translates roughly to, let me check. Muhammad is not but a messenger. Other messages have passed on before him. So if he was to die or be killed, would you turn back on your heels?
Yes, that's the one. Now, this is where the divergence between the traditional Orthodox view and Parwez's rationalist view splits wide open. Because traditionally, as the text notes, this verse is often interpreted as this necessary emotional comfort to the companions.
Like a reminder of human mortality.
Right. It's viewed as God soothing their grief, telling them essentially, hey, everyone dies eventually, even prophets. Keep your chin up and maintain your personal faith.
Okay, let me push back on that traditional view right away, because frankly, if I'm bleeding out on a battlefield and my entire government has just violently collapsed, a philosophical reminder that everybody dies isn't really going to motivate me to pick my sword back up.
And that is exactly Parwez's argument. The rationalist view says that treating this verse as some sort of condolence card completely misses the magnitude of the moment. The text argues that this verse is not about personal comfort at all.
What is it?
It is a rigid constitutional guarantee of institutional continuity. It's a legal charter meant to permanently separate the system from the man. And to understand why, we have to deep dive into the specific Arabic terms used in the verse and watch how Parwez moves them from a purely religious definition to a systemic one.
Okay, I'm with you. Let's look at the first phrase. Muhammad is but a messenger. The Arabic word used there is Rasul, right?
Yes, Rasul.
So in a traditional religious sense, a messenger is just, the one bringing the divine mail.
Yeah.
A highly revered holy figure whose physical person is meant to be venerated.
Correct. Traditionalism often centers heavily on personal ritualistic devotion to the prophet's physical being. Loving him, emulating exactly how he dressed, how he ate, venerating his relics. But rationally, according to this framework, the text argues that the Quran is establishing something far more infrastructural.
Infrastructural how?
The prophet's primary role was not to be a spiritual idol. His role was the practical, grueling establishment of a divine socio-economic order. The term the source uses for this order is Deen. The prophet is the pioneer of this objective system.
So the verse is essentially legally separating the office of the presidency from the mortal individual currently sitting at the resolute desk.
Precisely. It legally separates the markaz, which means the central authority or the state, from the biological life of the founder. The system of governance must be based on the rule of law, specifically the immutable principles of the Quran. That means the rule of law completely supersedes the rule of man.
Even if that man is the prophet himself.
Exactly, even if it's the prophet.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, if the system only works while the founder is breathing, it's a cult of personality, right? Not a civilization. Which brings us to the second half of the verse. So if he was to die or be killed, would you turn back on your heels? The Arabic term the source highlights here is inquilab.
Yes, inquilab. Typically, in a traditional context, turning back on your heels is translated simply as religious apostasy.
Like losing your religion.
Right. It means losing your personal faith in God just because your leader died.
But functionally, within this rationalist systemic framework we're talking about,
Right.
what does inquilab actually mean? Because if we just establish that the markaz is a state and a socio-economic system, then turning back has to be bigger than just, skipping your daily prayers.
Yeah.
What does this apostasy look like on a macro societal level?
Functionally, the text argues that incolab means the deliberate dismantling of the unified, consultative constitutional system. It's reverting back to a divided, sect-based system of personality worship.
So tearing down the state.
Yeah, it means fracturing the markaz. It is the separation of secular politics, what the text calls mulukiyat, or autocratic kingship, from ethical governance. And simultaneously, it's the outsourcing of your laws to a distinct religious priesthood.
Let me make sure I'm grasping this. You're saying that in this framework, systemic apostasy isn't about atheism at all. It's about abandoning the collective, unified system of law for the sake of worshiping a man. Or returning to a fractured system where a secular king taxes you and a religious priest tells you how to pray. That division is turning back on your heels.
Exactly. The destruction of collective constitutional unity is the ultimate apostasy. And to fully grasp why humanity is expected to maintain this system without a living prophet holding their hand, we have to look at perhaps the most pivotal concept in Parwez's entire thesis.
Okay, lay it on me.
The text introduces two interconnected ideas, beluga and katmi nubuwat.
Okay, I saw those terms in the reading, and I want to spend some real time here because this feels like the hinge upon which the entire philosophy swings. What do they actually mean?
Well, katmi nubuwat literally translates to the finality of prophethood, the absolute cessation of continuous prophets being sent to humanity.
Meaning no more prophets ever.
Right. Now, the text argues that for centuries, across the vast expanse of human history, humanity was essentially in a state of evolutionary childhood. Whenever an ancient society got lost, whenever they became corrupt or strayed from equitable living, a new prophet was sent with step-by-step, spoon-fed instructions to guide them back.
Like divine micromanagement. Because the human species, cognitively or socially, just wasn't mature enough to handle it themselves yet. They needed constant, direct intervention.
Yeah, they lacked the accumulated knowledge, the historical record, and the global awareness to maintain a universal system on their own. But the finality of prophethood marks a fundamental, permanent, evolutionary shift. It signifies bulugat.
Bulugat meaning intellectual maturity.
Yes, humanity has come of age. The era of continuous, step-by-step divine redemption is permanently closed. The heavens are shut in that regard.
Because
we no longer need divine figures to hold our hands. What's fascinating here is how this completely redefines the human-divine relationship.
I was thinking about this when I was preparing for the deep dive today.
Yeah.
It is exactly like raising a teenager.
Yeah, how so?
Think about it. For the first 10 years of a child's life, you hold their hand every single time you cross the street. You point out every danger. Don't touch the stove, it's hot. Look both ways. You sit in the passenger seat when they're learning to drive, and you physically hit the secondary brakes for them because they just don't know any better yet.
That's a great visual.
That constant protective intervention is continuous prophethood.
Right.
But Bulukat, intellectual maturity, is the day they turn 18.
Right.
It's the moment you hand them the car keys, you hand them a definitive, immutable map of the country, which in this framework is the Quran, and you say, you are an adult now. I'm no longer going to hit the brakes for you. I am not going to sit in the passenger seat. You must navigate the roads yourself using your own intellect, your own observation, your own data, and the map I gave you.
That analogy perfectly captures the gravity of what the text is arguing. The text says that God has entrusted humanity with a fully protected, unchanging constitution. We are now expected to use our own intellect, our own scientific data collection, and our own mutual consultation to govern our physical and social environments.
So we're totally on our own in terms of management.
Yes, we are not supposed to passively wait for a new prophet or a saint or some divine savior to descend from the clouds and tell us how to fix inflation or how to cure a disease or how to structure our tax code.
Which is terrifying if you really sit with it. It is the ultimate removal of the training wheels. You can no longer just look up at the sky, throw your hands up in the air and say, God, fix my economy. The responsibility is entirely crushingly on us.
It is terrifying, yeah. But the text frames it as the ultimate elevation of human dignity. It's the end of what Parwez calls the age of personalities, where we rely on charismatic individuals or divine emissaries to do the heavy lifting and the dawn of the age of humanity.
This shift in perspective also completely redefines some of the most basic terms people think they know. In the supplementary notes, the focus was brought to words like sabar and salat.
Right, very common terms.
Exactly. If humanity is mature and we are running this systemic markaz, What do these words actually mean? Because usually sabar just means patience, right? Like if you lose your job, you just have sabar, you sit quietly and you wait for things to get better.
And that passive definition is exactly what the rationalist framework attacks. In a systemic context, the text argues sabar does not mean passive endurance of suffering.
Then what is it?
It means steadfastness. It means sheer, unyielding perseverance in maintaining the objective system of the Markaz against all odds. It is the grit required to build a civilization, not the quiet acceptance of oppression.
Wow. And what about salat? Traditionally, that is the 5 daily ritual prayers, the physical act of bowing and prostrating.
While not denying the act of prayer itself, the systemic definition of salat in this text is much broader. It comes from an Arabic root meaning to follow closely, like a horse following the leader in a race.
Oh, interesting.
Therefore, establishing salat means establishing a society that closely follows the divine roadmap. It's the establishment of the assembly, the actual operationalizing of the Constitution in daily societal life. It is following the system.
So we have this mature humanity, we have the car keys. We're supposed to be steadfastly following the roadmap.
Yeah.
But here's my biggest question, and I think this transitions us out of the linguistic theory and into the practical reality.
Let's hear it.
If we're the mature teenager with the keys, how exactly are we supposed to drive? I mean, how is this global, mature humanity supposed to govern itself, draft laws, and resolve disputes without a prophet physically present in the room to make the final infallible call?
That is the perfect question, and it takes us straight into the core mechanism of governance in this framework. The engine that makes this entire mature society run is a concept called shura.
Shura, meaning mutual consultation.
Yes, but we need to tread very carefully here, because the text makes a vital, uncompromising distinction about what shura actually is in practice. Traditionally, across many historical empires and caliphates, shura was viewed merely as a non-binding advisory council.
Right. A king, a sultan, or an autocrat sits on a golden throne. He summons his viziers, his elders, or his council of scholars. He listens to their advice on whether to go to war or raise taxes, and then, after nodding politely, he completely ignores them and does whatever he wanted to do in the first place.
Exactly. It was advisory, not authoritative. The king retained absolute power. But in the rationalist framework Parwez lays out, shura is the binding, authoritative legislative process of the millat, the community.
Binding, as in they have the final say.
Yes, it is the active legislative engine of the Markaz. The community must manage its affairs through mutual intellectual consensus. No single individual, no autocrat, and certainly no class of clergy can claim a monopoly on the divine will or override the consultative consensus of the people.
Now, wait a minute. Let me play devil's advocate here for a second. You say mutual consultation, elected representatives, binding consensus. You are basically just describing modern Western democracy. What is the difference between shura and just voting for a parliament in London or a Congress in Washington?
On a purely mechanical level, they are very similar. Both rely on debate, data, and voting. But the text highlights a profound philosophical difference in the locus of sovereignty. Where does the ultimate authority reside?
Okay, I'm listening.
In modern secular democracy, the human majority has absolute, unrestricted sovereignty to decide what is fundamentally right and wrong.
Meaning the power of the people is the ultimate ceiling. There's nothing above it.
Yes. If 51% of the population, or a supermajority in a legislature, votes to enact a law that is fundamentally unjust, say, they vote to strip a specific ethnic minority of their voting rights, or they vote to legalize a severe form of economic exploitation, technically, the democratic system allows for that, because the majority rules absolutely. Even the Constitution itself can be completely rewritten, amended, or discarded if the human majority desires it.
I see where you're going with this. So in Parwez's system, the majority does not have that absolute power.
Precisely. In the Quranic system outlined by the text, the human majority does not possess absolute sovereignty to define objective morality. The Quran provides the unchangeable divine constitution. The text calls these the permanent values, things like absolute justice, equitable wealth distribution, the sanctity of human life, human dignity. Those are locked in.
Locked in permanently.
Yes. A 99% majority cannot vote to abolish them.
It's like having an immutable Bill of Rights that no popular referendum can ever touch. You can never hold a national vote to bring back slavery, for example, because the permanent value of human dignity expressly forbids it, regardless of what the majority wants.
That is exactly it. The core constitution is protected from the whims of human emotion and mob rule. So, what is the actual job of the shura then? If the permanent values are locked, Shura operates strictly within those four walls to frame the evolving administrative details, the contemporary bylaws. The term the text uses for these evolving details is juz'iyat.
Let's go back to our driving analogy. The permanent value is the sanctity of life. You cannot intentionally run people over. That is locked.
Right.
But the city council, acting as the shura, has to figure out how to practically protect life on the roads today. So they use modern data, traffic studies, and civil engineering research to decide where to place the traffic lights, what the speed limit should be on a new highway, and how to zone the commercial districts. Those are the juz'iyats, the bylaws.
That is a phenomenal way to explain it. The Quran left the administrative details intentionally open because, as we established, humanity is mature and humanity is constantly evolving. The socio-economic problems of the 7th century Arabian desert are vastly different from the problems of a 21st century digital economy.
Absolutely.
Therefore, the text argues for the absolute necessity of what we might call data-driven shura. Because we are mature Balubat, we must use modern scientific observation, empirical research, sociology, and economics to frame contemporary policies.
So, according to this text, we shouldn't be scouring a 1,000-year-old historical text trying to find out how to regulate artificial intelligence or how to manage high-frequency algorithmic stock trading. We should be gathering the best modern data and using Shura to create new juz'iyat that ensure AI and modern banking don't violate the permanent values of equity and justice.
Exactly. It is a highly dynamic, incredibly modern, and forward-looking system. It demands constant intellectual engagement with the present world, not a romantic obsession with the past.
That sounds incredible in theory. It really does. But, I have a natural skeptic. Did this actually work in practice? When the prophet passed away, taking that central, unifying, charismatic presence out of the equation, did the system hold? Or did everybody just immediately turn back on their heels?
It's a critical question, and the text points to the immediate aftermath of the prophet's death as the ultimate historical proof of concept. When the prophet passed away, there was, as we discussed with the Battle of Uhud, immense shock. The reality of his mortality hit the community hard, but the transition of power was successfully managed. Hazrat Abu Bakr, who became the first caliph, stepped up and firmly established the consultative markaz.
How did he manage that? How do you calm a panicked, grieving nation and transfer power without a civil war breaking out?
The source notes a very specific, legendary historical moment. Abu Bakr stood before the panicked, weeping community in Medina. And what did he do? He recited this exact verse we've been talking about, Surah Al-Imran, verse 144.
The one about Muhammad being but a messenger?
Exactly. He reminded them, Muhammad is but a messenger. If he were to die, would you turn back on your heels? He reportedly told the crowd in this moment of supreme constitutional clarity, whoever worshipped Muhammad, know that Muhammad is dead. But whoever worships the God of Muhammad, know that God is alive and never dies.
Wow. He basically weaponized the verse to save the state. He used the Constitution to physically shift the people's allegiance from the mortal man lying in the next room to the immortal system they were supposed to be building.
That is a powerful way to phrase it, and it's exactly what Parwez argues. The text claims that Abu Bakr successfully validated the social contract right then and there. He proved, in real time, that allegiance was to the Quranic system, the permanent values, and the markaz, not to the physical personality of the prophet.
So the system worked.
It did. The community then used Shura mutual consultation to elect him as the executive and to manage the affairs of the state moving forward. The system survived the founder. The map outlived the cartographer.
Okay, so we've established the linguistic foundation. We have explored the governance engine of Shura and juz'iyat. Now I want to move to the material reality. Because all of this governance, this constitution, this data-driven consultation, what is the ultimate goal? What is the state actually supposed to do for the people living in it? A state can't just exist to hold meetings.
No, it can't. And you are hitting on the absolute core of Parwez's thesis here. This is where we get into the economic engine of the state, the concepts of adl and nizami rubiyat.
Let's define those, because this is where the theory hits the pavement.
So adl simply means justice, not just legal justice in a courtroom, but systemic structural justice across the board. But rubiyat is a massive, all-encompassing concept. It translates to universal sustenance or the system of providence.
Universal sustenance.
Right. In this rationalist framework, the primary duty of the markaz, the central authority, is not just to maintain basic law and order or guard the borders or collect taxes to build palaces. Its absolute, non-negotiable constitutional mandate is to conquer the forces of nature through science, generate resources, and ensure the equitable distribution of wealth.
Wait, hold on a second. Conquer the forces of nature through science. That sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel, not a theological text. What does that actually mean practically?
It means the state must heavily invest in agriculture, engineering, medicine, and technology. You cannot have universal sustenance if you don't have enough food.
Yeah,
You cannot have universal sustenance if your people are dying of preventable diseases.
right.
The text argues that the physical universe was created to be harnessed by mature human intellect. The state's job is to extract those resources, whether it's solar power, advanced crop yields, or medical breakthroughs, and then ensure that the resulting wealth is distributed so that absolutely no one is left behind.
So economics is not a side issue here. It's not something left entirely to the invisible hand of the free market, but it's also not described here as some grim Soviet-style command economy where everyone is equally poor. It is the core theological mandate of the state to create abundance and guarantee basic needs.
Completely. The text argues that universal sustenance means that the basic needs of every single citizen, food, shelter, clothing, education, healthcare, are guaranteed by the state as a fundamental constitutional right. This isn't charity.
It's not a handout.
No, this isn't the rich throwing crumbs to the poor to feel good about themselves. This is the baseline requirement of a functioning markaz derived directly from those permanent values.
And to achieve this incredible level of systemic justice, the text proposes some very provocative action items. I mean, reading the source material, Parwez advocates for things that would completely upend the current status quo in many parts of the world today.
Let's talk about the first massive hurdle he identifies. The text calls for the total abolition of personal laws. What does he mean by that, and why is it a barrier to rububiyat? To really understand this critique, you have to look at how many societies, particularly in South Asia and the Middle East, operate today. Currently, in many places, you have deeply divided legal systems based entirely on sectarian lines.
Right. So if I am a citizen of one of these countries, the law applies to me differently depending on how I pray. If I belong to the Sunni sect, my marriage, my inheritance rights, my divorce proceedings, and my personal disputes are handled by a judge using Sunni jurisprudence. If I am Shia, I go to a completely different court, and my life is handled by Shia jurisprudence. If I'm Hanafi, Maliki, Jafari, etc., I follow the specific historical rulings of that specific school of thought.
Exactly. The law literally changes depending on your sectarian identity. But the text vehemently argues that true justice demands a single, unified public law for all citizens without exception. Having divided legal systems fundamentally fractures the state. It violates the overarching Quranic mandate of unity.
Let me push back here again, because to a modern liberal ear, abolishing personal laws sounds like a violation of religious freedom. If a specific sect wants to handle their marriages according to their own 1,000-year-old traditions, isn't it tyrannical for the central state to step in and say, no, you must use our unified public law? How does Parwez justify eradicating these sectarian courts?
It's a fair question, it really is. And the text addresses this by looking at the practical outcome of divided law. Parwez argues that you simply cannot run a cohesive socioeconomic system, a markaz, if the definition of justice changes from neighborhood to neighborhood.
Give me an example.
Well, how can a central authority guarantee equitable wealth distribution, particularly regarding inheritance or women's economic rights, if a citizen can just bypass the state's economic plan by claiming their sect's personal law allows them to distribute wealth differently?
Ah, I see. It creates a state within a state, or rather dozens of competing microstates within the borders of one nation.
Precisely. It creates insurmountable friction. The text argues that to fulfill the mandate of rububiyat, sectarian jurisprudence must be eradicated at a state legislative level. The Central Shura must legislate a single, unified public law applicable to everyone, derived directly from the permanent values of the Quran using modern data. Personal spiritual beliefs regarding the afterlife are private, but economic, criminal, and civil codes must be universally unified.
Which leads directly into his second equally provocative action item, dismantling religious monopolies.
Yes, the text identifies a historical dualism that emerged over centuries, a tragic fracture where society split into two distinct spheres, secular politics on one side and religious priesthood on the other.
Now, in the West, we call that the separation of church and state, and we generally view it as a triumph of the Enlightenment. We think it's a very good thing. But Parwez frames this separation as a total catastrophe. Why?
He frames it as a catastrophe because, in his paradigm, the state is the ethical body. True governance integrates ethical economics into statecraft. The moment politics became separated from the divine socio-economic order, Those permanent values we talked about, the state became purely secular, Machiavellian, and often tyrannical. Kings and autocrats no longer felt bound by the mandate to provide rubaiyat. They just collected taxes and built armies.
And what happened to the religion in this scenario?
To fill the spiritual void left by a secularized, ruthless state, a separate, distinct class of religious clergy emerged. And the text uses incredibly harsh terminology here. It calls this clerical class a parasitic necessity that thrives on dividing the populace.
That is aggressive language, parasitic necessity.
It is very aggressive. The argument is that if the state is successfully implementing rubaiyat, if the markaz is ensuring economic equity, building hospitals, funding schools, and guaranteeing justice through a unified public law, there is absolutely no need for a separate priestly class whose primary function is to manage esoteric sectarian rituals and enforce divided personal laws. The state, the economy, and ethical governance are supposed to be one unified, inseparable entity.
Okay, this is a perfect transition into the historical reality, because we have painted this beautiful intellectual picture of a unified system driven by data, implementing universal sustenance, governed by a binding shura. But I look at the world today, I look at the historical timeline, and that is not what I see. If this unified system was so perfect, what went wrong? Why do we have the fractured, sect-based, economically unequal societies that the text is criticizing so fiercely today? Where did the wheels actually fall off the wagon?
To answer that, we have to look at the very final part of verse 144. It is a chilling phrase. Regarding the society that turns back on its heels, the verse concludes, "He will never harm Allah at all."
Now, traditionally, reading that, I would assume it just means God is omnipotent. God is sitting on a throne above the universe. If you sin, if you do something wrong, you aren't hurting God. You're just hurting yourself spiritually. God remains untouched.
And once again, the rationalist paradigm completely shifts this reading. The text frames this phrase not as a statement of divine ego, but as a concept of social physics. It introduces an objective, unbending scientific law of cause and effect, which Parwez calls the law of requital, or mukafati amal.
Social physics. I really like that framing. So it's not about divine anger or lightning bolts striking sinners from the sky.
Not at all. The text argues that the universe operates on strict physical laws like thermodynamics or gravity. You step off a cliff, you fall. Gravity doesn't hate you. Gravity is just a law. Similarly, human societies operate on strict social laws.
So what happens when a society breaks those laws?
If a society abandons its unified consultative constitution, if it stops using data-driven shura, if it fractures into sects, if it allows wealth to hoard at the top while the poor starve, the universe doesn't get angry, the society simply guarantees its own physical, economic, and political destruction.
The law of requital is as reliable as gravity. You abandon equitable wealth distribution, your society collapses into chaos, crime, and despair.
So historically speaking, when did the community step off the cliff?
The text details a massive historical tragedy, the fall into mulukiyat, or autocratic kingship. After the period of the early caliphs, people like Abu Bakr and Umar, who actively maintained the shura, the unified markaz collapsed. Power was violently seized by kings and dynasties, most notably during the Umayyad and Abbasid eras.
So the system of binding mutual consultation was just destroyed.
Completely dismantled. Because think about it, if you are a king wanting to build an empire and pass the throne to your son, the absolute last thing you want is a binding constitutional body of citizens telling you what to do with the treasury.
Right, they'd get in the way. Exactly. The kings didn't want to be bound by permanent values. They wanted absolute, unchecked power. So politics was divorced from Deen. The divine socio-economic order was pushed entirely out of the halls of government.
This creates a massive vacuum. If the kings took over the state, secularized it, and made it an autocracy, what happened to the law? Where did the people look for guidance if the state was no longer providing ethical leadership?
This is where we enter the most extensive, controversial, and critical historical analysis in the source text. This is the origin story of the fracture. To fill the void left by a unified ethical state, the separate religious class we mentioned earlier began to solidify. But because the prophet was long dead and the living shura was disbanded by the kings, this new religious class needed a way to justify their authority. They needed a source of law to formulate their personal laws.
Right, because they couldn't rely on the king was corrupt. And they couldn't rely on the open, dynamic consultation of the Quran because that requires a free society, which they didn't have.
Exactly. And the text argues this is the exact historical moment when the compilation of hadith, the oral traditions, sayings, and alleged daily habits attributed to the prophet, became the new foundational bedrock of sectarian law. Now, the source text dives deep into this history, and it mounts a massive structural critique of how these traditions were compiled and why relying on them destroyed the public law.
Walk us through this carefully, because I know this is a highly sensitive topic for many. What is Parwez's core argument against using these oral traditions as state law?
First, the text emphasizes a crucial timeline. It points out that these oral traditions were not compiled, written down, or codified as state law during the prophet's own lifetime. Furthermore, the source makes a very specific historical claim that the early caliphs actively resisted, forbade, and even destroyed early attempts to compile these sayings.
Wait, really? The source claims that the earliest leaders of the community, the closest companions of the prophet, burned his sayings. Why on earth would they do that?
The source quotes historical records stating that Abu Bakr, the first caliph, had personally collected about 500 hadiths, but then burned them. His reasoning, according to the text, was a fear that they contained inaccuracies due to human memory, or that they would distract the populace from the primary constitution, the Quran.
That is a staggering claim.
The text goes further. It claims that Umar, the second caliph, spent an entire month consulting with the community using shura about whether to officially write down the hadiths to form a legal code.
And what was the verdict?
After a month of debate, he decided firmly against it. The text quotes him stating explicitly that he feared previous nations had been ruined because they abandoned the primary book of God to write their own supplementary books, and he would not allow the Quran to be mixed with human traditions.
So the text is arguing that the earliest, closest companions believed the Quran alone was sufficient as the written constitution for the state. They didn't want a secondary, human-curated, legal text competing with it.
Yes. The text points out that during the era of the early caliphs, when the Islamic State was expanding rapidly, managing complex economies and encountering new civilizations, there was no official state-sponsored book of hadith anywhere.
Fascinating.
The only text authenticated and distributed by the central authority was the Quran. The evolving laws, the juz'iyat, were handled by the living shura based on the needs of the time, not by looking up what the prophet supposedly said 20 years prior about a completely different situation.
Okay, so if the early caliphs didn't compile them, when did the massive books of hadith that form the basis of sectarian law today actually get compiled?
This is the crux of the text's argument. The major canonical collections of hadith, the books universally relied upon today, compiled by scholars like Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, and Nasai, were compiled roughly 250 to 300 years after the prophet's death.
2.5 centuries later. I mean, that is a massive chronological gap for oral traditions to survive without distortion. That is, what, 10 generations of human memory?
At least, yeah.
I mean, think about that. That is like us today in the 2020s trying to compile a legally binding book of the exact verbatim daily conversations of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, based entirely on a game of telephone passed down through 10 generations of farmers and merchants, and then trying to use those whispered quotes to run the Supreme Court today.
That is exactly the analogy the text implies, and the source emphasizes the geographic disconnect as well as the chronological one. The text notes that these 6 major compilers were largely non-Arabs from places like Iran, Persia, and Central Asia. They were collecting oral traditions hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away from Medina, hundreds of years after the fact, in a completely different cultural and political landscape dominated by autocratic kings.
But how did they even begin to sift through that? I mean, after 250 years of political turmoil, civil wars, and sectarian splits, there must have been thousands of fabricated quotes floating around. People making up quotes to support their favorite king or their specific theological stance.
Hundreds of thousands. The text highlights the staggering volume of discarded material to make its point about the unreliability of the entire process. It cites that Imam Bukhari, perhaps the most famous and revered compiler, reportedly examined around 600,000 oral traditions floating around the empire.
600,000 separate quotes.
Yes. And out of those 600,000, he selected only a few thousand to keep in his book. He discarded the vast, overwhelming majority of what he heard as unreliable or fabricated.
Okay, but wait. If he threw out over 590,000 quotes, on what basis did he keep the remaining few thousand?
That is the critical, rationalist question the text asks. On what basis were they discarded? It wasn't based on divine revelation. It was based entirely on Bukhari's own human judgment, specifically his research into the character of the narrators, a biographical field called Azma-Uridal.
Meaning he tried to verify the honesty of the people in the chain of transmission. Like, did Guy A actually meet Guy B, and was Guy B a known liar?
Exactly. But the text argues that a single man sitting in Central Asia 250 years later, attempting to verify the memory, political biases, and honesty of a chain of 5 or 6 people spanning centuries, is an inherently flawed, deeply subjective, and purely human endeavor. I mean, how can you accurately judge the hidden motives of a man who died 150 years before you were even born?
It's an incredible feat of historical scholarship, no doubt. The dedication is mind-boggling. But the text is saying you cannot build an immutable divine state constitution on a human methodology that inherently requires throwing out 99% of its data points because the data is so corrupted.
Right. And what was the historical result of this endeavor? The text points out that because these different compilers use different human criteria to judge the narrators, their resulting books often contradict each other. The Sunni collections contradict the Shia collections entirely. Even within the major Sunni collections, there are glaring contradictions on legal rulings. And this, Parwez argues, is the ultimate origin of the unsolvable web of sectarianism that paralyzes the society today.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the text is essentially arguing when the society abandoned the singular, protected constitution of the Quran and the dynamic living consultation of the Shura, and instead chose to rely on centuries-old, contradictory oral traditions curated by fallible humans, they destroyed the unified public law. They created a fragmented system where every sect has its own private set of laws based on which human scholar they decided to trust.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, is exactly right. The text argues that this historical shift from a dynamic, consultative public law to static, sept-based personal laws fueled modern societal paralysis. When the state fractures like this, it can no longer enforce rububiyat. It cannot conquer nature. It cannot build a unified economy.
Because they're too busy arguing.
Exactly. Instead, the society gets bogged down in endless, bitter theological debates about the reliability of an 8th century narrator, while their actual physical economy collapses and inequality skyrockets. The law of requital plays out in real time. They stepped off the cliff and they hit the ground.
Which brings us to the psychological toll of all this. Because there is a profound psychological fallout to this historical fracture, isn't there? When the system breaks, when the kings take over, when the law fractures into a million sectarian pieces, and people completely lose the power of collective shura to solve their own problems. What happens to their mindset? How does the average person cope with that reality?
The text describes a descent into total societal despair. When the community lost its political power to autocrats and its unified law to sectarian clergy, it psychologically regressed. It returned to the childhood we spoke about earlier.
The teenager realized that driving was too hard, the road was too scary, they crashed the car, and now they are sitting on the curb crying, wishing their parents would come pick them up.
That is exactly the psychology. But instead of learning how to fix the car, instead of using their intellect to rebuild the shura, they developed what the text calls the theology of passivity. They developed religious doctrines that essentially said, the world is broken, it is inherently evil, and there is absolutely nothing we, as ordinary humans, can do about it until a hidden savior arrives.
The savior complex.
Exactly. The belief that at the end of times, or at the turn of every century, a Mahi, or a Mujadid, a divine reformer, or a hidden messiah, will miraculously descend from the heavens or emerge from hiding. And this magical figure will single-handedly fix the socio-economic reality, unite the warring sects, slaughter the autocrats, and restore global justice without the people having to lift a finger.
It is the ultimate abdication of civic responsibility. I mean, if I truly believe that a magical savior is scheduled to arrive and fix the global economy, why should I bother studying data-driven economics? Why should I organize my community? Why should I fight for a consultative government? I just need to sit in my house, pray quietly, and wait for the rescue team.
And that waiting, the text argues, is exactly what autocrats and the religious monopolies want. A passive waiting population is a population that is incredibly easy to control. The text points out a fascinating sociological pattern. Almost every defeated, oppressed, or politically disenfranchised society in human history eventually develops a messianic myth out of sheer desperation. It is a psychological coping mechanism for systemic failure.
But Parwez's rationalist call to action shatters that coping mechanism completely, doesn't it?
Violently shatters it. The text contrasts this passivity directly with the core message of verse 144 that we started with. Muhammad was but a messenger, and he died. Humanity is mature. Bulugat, prophethood is final. Kat Nubuwat. The text argues that the era of divine personalities stepping in to save us from our own systemic failures is permanently over.
So nobody's coming.
Right. No one is coming from the heavens to fix our inflation. No hidden savior is going to emerge to clean up our corrupt tax codes or cure our diseases.
The text is arguing that the responsibility rests squarely, heavily, and exclusively on our shoulders, the living, breathing community. If we want an equitable world, we must use our mature intellect, we must gather the scientific data, and we must use mutual consultation, Shura, to build it ourselves. If we don't do it, it simply doesn't get done. And the law of requital will ensure we face the physical, brutal consequences of our inaction, poverty, subjugation, and societal collapse.
That is the ultimate empowerment and simultaneously the ultimate burden of the rationalist framework. It is a call for aggressive, unapologetic civic empowerment. It demands that humanity stand on its own 2 feet.
So let's bring this all together. We have journeyed from a chaotic battlefield rumor in 7th century Medina through the systemic definitions of constitutional continuity into the compilation of oral traditions in 9th century Persia, all the way to the psychology of modern political despair. What is the grand synthesis here? What is the overarching permanent value that this text leaves us with?
The overarching theme of Parwez's analysis is the absolute mortality of leadership versus the immortality of a constitutional ideology. The text demands a permanent transition from an age of personalities, where we rely on individuals, charismatic leaders, saviors, or historical clergy to dictate our lives, to the age of humanity, where we rely on objective principles, scientific data, and our collective intellectual maturity to build a just world.
And addressing you, our listener, directly. Why does this deep dive into 20th century rationalist theology and Islamic history actually matter for your life today?
It matters because it is a profound, universal reminder to reject passivity in all areas of your life.
Think about it. How often do we fall into our own secular version of the savior complex? We sit at our desks and wait for a perfect visionary boss to get hired and magically fix our toxic company culture. We wait for a flawless, charismatic politician to get elected and magically fix the country's deep structural issues. We wait for a sudden windfall or a perfect market condition to fix our personal finances. We treat our democratic constitutions like that blueprint from the beginning of the deep dive. We praise the ideals of equality and justice, but we don't do the grueling mechanical work of building the plumbing.
Wow. Yeah.
This framework challenges that passivity entirely. It looks you in the eye and says, stop waiting. You are mature. The map is in your hands. Start utilizing your own intellect, gather your data, and consult with your community to build the equitable systems you want to see. Because no one else is going to build them for you.
It is a radical, sobering call to human agency.
But, and this is a massive but, this framework also raises a towering question. A question that I honestly can't stop thinking about. We've established today that the core constitution is unchangeable, but the bylaws must adapt through Shura. We've said that the central authority, the Markaz, is tasked with guaranteeing wealth distribution and universal sustenance rubaiyat.
Yeah, right. That's the mandate.
But how? I mean, if the state has the immense power and the constitutional mandate to enforce rubaiyat, to extract resources and ensure that absolutely no one is left behind, how exactly does it do that without turning into a tyrannical, overbearing, centralized dictatorship? How do you mandate charity, enforce equity, and manage universal sustenance while completely destroying individual human freedom and innovation?
That is the ultimate tension between economics and governance. It is the razor's edge of political theory. And it is exactly the mechanism we will be unpacking in our next deep dive into this framework.
I cannot wait for that one. We're going to have to dive into the actual economics of this proposed state.
Me neither. But to close out today's conversation, the text leaves us with one last highly provocative thing to ponder. It challenges us to take a hard look in the mirror at our own societies, our own lives. Are the traditions and rituals we cling to today, whether in our religion, our politics, or even our daily corporate habits, actually monuments to our own intellectual maturity? Or are they just comfortable, familiar blankets we wrap around ourselves to avoid the incredibly hard, scientific, collaborative work of building a genuinely just society? Until next time, keep diving deep.